Have you ever taken an afternoon nap and woken up feeling completely disoriented? For a few seconds, you don't know where you are. You sit up, you look around, and then it comes to you. You're either at home or at a friend's house or maybe in a hotel room. The panic subsides. Well, something similar happened to my father several years ago. He sat up in bed after an afternoon nap, but he didn't know where he was, and he didn't know for quite some time. He got up, went down the stairs in a house he didn't recognize, and as he called out and realized there was no one at home and he was alone, he began to feel afraid. He walked out the front door, went to a neighbor's, a man he'd known for years, and asked, "Where am I?" The man replied, "Tom, you're at home. Your wife will be home soon. You're safe." Indeed, his wife, my mother, was home soon. And gradually, my father began to recognize his surroundings. He knew where he was. But the shock didn't leave for quite some time. He talked about it for the rest of the day. How was it possible he didn't know his own home, didn't recognize his neighbor, who'd been his friends for decades, and didn't realize or recognize the street on which he lived? This was 2 years before my father received a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. It was the start of a journey for him. Tom Sweeney is his name. And it was the beginning of a journey for his family too. None of us quite knew what to expect. We thought maybe he would eventually forget names and dates and places, perhaps in time not recognize his family. But Alzheimer's is far more complex than that. It's far more complicated. It wears many different colors, and it happens in very different stages, and it impacts people very differently. It was a journey that none of us had expected to take, but it's one that changed us all fundamentally. By the time my father's disease has progressed, he is at the stage where the day-to-day tasks of ordinary everyday living are beyond him. So he begins to take pride and joy in the simplest of things. The door opening and a favorite carer walking through the room, or perhaps a shared meal, laughter, company, the comfort of company, knowing he feels safe, knowing he feels belonging, and importantly for a man like our father, knowing that he is still of use. Tom Sweeney had many favorite carers. There were so many of them that he was lucky to have. "You are a gem," he would say, at a task well performed or a lovely cup of tea served. Apart from my brothers, all of his carers were women. Women who lovingly wove a cocoon of care around him, helping him feel as safe and as secure as possible. There is a paper from 2006 written by an academic called Lisa Snyder, and she talks about how important it is to center the person with dementia first, respond to their needs, follow their lead. And to paraphrase, she says something along the lines of, if we are to understand a person with dementia, we really have to treat it as though the well-being, our well-being, but also the well-being of humanity depends on their well-being. And this is something my father's carers took to heart. They put him first. They never argued with him, even when he was at his most anxious, even when he would assert the most completely illogical possibilities of things that had happened, but of course hadn't, or things that might happen, and of course wouldn't. Tom was lucky to have great carers. He was also lucky to have carers at all. He was able to afford them. Those carers treated him as though their well-being depended on his well-being. To talk about dementia a little, across the world today, 55 million people live with dementia. And by 2050, that's 25 years from now, that number is expected to triple. 150 people will be living with the disease. Dementia is a catch-all umbrella term for different kinds of dementias, of which there's vascular dementia, Lewy bodies, Parkinson's, and of course, the most common, Alzheimer's, among others. And for each person diagnosed, 2 to 4 more people are impacted around the world. Most of those most immediately impacted are family carers, and most family carers are women. In Europe, for example, about 62% of informal care is carried out by women, and that number is 66% when it comes to providing long-term care. So 66% of long-term care in Europe is provided by women. And women are also more likely to develop dementia. In Europe today, there are 6.5 million people, women, I should say, living with disease. 6.5 million women are living with dementia compared to just over 3 million men. And being a family carer brings with it unique situations. All the usual senses of love and duty, compassion, care, obligation, familiarity get confused as the family carer begins to put often the person they're caring for, their loved one, first before their own needs. Friends say, take care of yourself, mind yourself, but it's often easier said than done. And over time, that sustained pressure leads to stress, leads to depression, social isolation, and perhaps physical inactivity. And these are all stressors for potentially developing dementia at a later stage. Because the brain is like a muscle, and if it's constantly operating at full throttle, there's no or little cognitive reserve to cope with the changes that happen to the brain as we age, and of course, if we're unfortunate enough to have an injury. Being a family carer changes you, and when it ends, you may feel grief, but you may also have a contradictory feeling of relief, profound loss, exhaustion, and even perhaps a loss of identity. And this is why brain health matters, not just for people living with dementia, but for all of us. As we age, psychological and cognitive wellness are as important to our health as physical fitness. And while it's never too early to start, it's important to start caring for our brains in midlife, not in old age. So managing blood pressure, not having social isolation, having plenty of friends, being physically active, diet, low cholesterol, all the things that are good for your heart are also good for your brain. But these aren't just good habits that we should adapt in life at any stage, the earlier the better. There's strong scientific evidence that by taking up these good, healthy practices, that 45% of dementias can be prevented. That's almost half. So if you think to 2050, when we think there may be 150 million people living with dementia, take that down by 45%, and how many lives will not be impacted by people around the world trying to adapt to healthier lifestyles. About a year after my father died, I came across his laptop. It was very old, it hadn't been used in many years, and the battery didn't work, even when I tried to charge it up. So I had to find another plug that would work, and to my shock, when I opened his laptop and looked at his desktop, there were articles from newspapers from 2011. This was 6 years before he was diagnosed with dementia. The articles were about mortality. There was one article from a newspaper that said, take this easy quiz to know if you had Alzheimer's. And so it was with a degree of shock that I began to realize that my father had known that there was something wrong for 6 years at least. before he began investigating. My father was brought up in the shadow of the Second World War. He was of that generation that didn't complain. He was stoic. But also, I realized looking at those articles that he was afraid of the stigma of dementia, afraid to go to the doctor to find out what, to him, would have seemed the certainty of a death sentence. He particularly was afraid of the stigma because he felt that saying he had dementia would define him. And it's that fear of the unknown, which can be worse than the diagnosis itself. But the important thing to know is that for him in 2011, there were supports. And the earlier there is an intervention, in other words, the sooner you go to the doctor, the sooner a diagnosis can be made, and the sooner supports become available. And today, in 2025, there are far more supports now than there were in 2011. For example, it's now possible to do blood tests, so diagnosis of Alzheimer's is becoming easier. And why is that important, that you know you've Alzheimer's? Because it's better than waiting a year or 2 or 3, being afraid to go to the doctor and not doing anything about it and hoping that it will go away. And the supports that are there for people with dementia today are far greater than they have ever been. And therapies are improving all the time. There are drugs that are being trialed right now that are slowing the progress of the disease. And these drugs and trials combined with supports can really extend the quality of someone's life and also the quality of life they have with their family. So my urging today, or my call to action would be today, that if you think you're forgetting things or you're confused or you know somebody who's confused and forgetting things, go see your doctor, ask for help. Because very often, it doesn't automatically mean at all that dementia will be diagnosed. It can often be something called mild cognitive impairment, which can be due to those risk factors I spoke of earlier, lack of sleep, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, etc. So my father's journey changed him, obviously, changed the trajectory of his life, and it also changed all those around him. But I should say that Tom Sweeney was never defined by dementia. And I should also say that he single-handedly, by the time he had died, had stripped away the misconceptions we as a family had had about what we thought Alzheimer's was. He never forgot us. He remembered his family right to the end. It is important to start talking about brain health. Brain health is self-care. Brain health is dementia prevention. Brain health is hope. And my hope is that in the next few years, we'll be talking about dementia in the way that we now talk about cancer. So if you think back 10, 20, 30 years ago, cancer seemed to be this automatic death sentence. People talked about it in hushed voices. Whereas now we talk about it quite openly. As a society, we're aware of the various stages of cancer, the various types of cancer. My hope, with all the supports coming through and the diagnostics and the therapies, that we can start to do the same with dementia, raise awareness. A bit also like HIV. That was a condition that was once fatal, but now can be managed through care, medication, and public awareness. So I ask you to please change the story of dementia. Let's appreciate our carers. Let's remove the stigma. And if you know anyone who may be forgetful or a little confused, a friend, a family member, someone you work with, encourage them to go to the doctor gently. Please make it so that no one ever need be afraid to ask for help. Gurmila Magod.